So today we begin the 13th blessing, the blessing for the righteous. And to put it back into its context again, 3 blessings ago, we pivoted from individual personal requests to national ones when we had the concept of the ingathering of all of the exiles of the entire Jewish nation coming together. Obviously, the ultimate purpose of that, what that leads to, the aspiration, the hope is that that leads then to the rebuilding of the temple and the coming of Mashiach. But before that can happen, there are 3 things that have to be put in place. And those are the last 2 blessings and the 3rd blessing today that we have been discussing, or that we will be discussing. So the first thing which had to happen was that there has to be justice in the world. Justice has to be restored. Without justice, you do not have a basis upon which everything else can flourish and go forward. There's no sense whatsoever in having a Mashiach or having a temple unless we have prepared the ground by creating a just society. That was the first thing. The second is that one has to try and remove evil from the world and create a space, a fertile space within which goodness can flourish. And the third precondition for the rebuilding of the temple, coming of Mashiach, is the blessing which we're going to discuss today, the blessing of the righteous, al-Hatzadikim, for the righteous, the pious, the elders of your people, etc., etc. And I suppose there's a question to be asked over here as to why this does not come before the previous blessing. Why do we have a blessing that seeks to eliminate evil first, and only then afterwards do the righteous begin to flourish? Perhaps one could argue that if the righteous were to come earlier, they would help to eliminate evil in the world. Surely the presence of the righteous and their acts, etc., shows people what is the possible, what human beings are capable of. They show an example, of the highest level, and as a consequence, the evil and those who seek to destroy and to undermine the principles of justice, the principles of Judaism, will be undermined because of the power of those who are just and righteous. But that apparently was not in the sages' minds. So they deliberately said we have to clear the field first. And I suppose that in a sense accords with something which we say in Psalms, in our Shabbat prayers, Su mera v'asei tov. First of all, one has to remove evil, and only afterwards can you do good. And the reason for that is because to attempt to do good while the evil is still around means that very often those who are the good guys simply get shunted to a side. Fake news, they don't really belong in the world, etc. They don't have an opportunity to flourish. And one has to clear out the thorns before one can begin to plant the flowers. That seems to be the idea over here in terms of the sequencing. So in any event, here we have a special prayer for the righteous to be able to flourish in the world, to create the groundswell of awareness about the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So with that, then we can begin to create an atmosphere in which it is ripe for Yerushalayim to be rebuilt and for the Mashiach to come, etc., and the following blessings. And we pray for 6 groups of people in this prayer over here, for the tzaddikim, for the Hasidim, for the Zignei Amcha Beit Yisrael, for the Pleitat Sofreihem, for the Gerei HaTzedek, and for ourselves. And one of the things we're going to have to try and understand in this blessing is what is the distinction between these. Some of them are easier to understand. Tzaddikim and Hasidim are well-known terms, but who are the Pleitat Sofreihem? Who are what are called over here, the remnants of the scholars? Remnants from who? What remnants? So that's one puzzling term. And the other thing which is extremely puzzling over here is the fact that we have included, amongst all these great giants of studying of Torah and of good deeds, etc., we have included converts as well. These converts are referred to over here as Gerei Tzedek, and that, of course, is the way in which we refer to a true convert. We call him a Gerei Tzedek, a righteous convert, as opposed to somebody who's a convert for reasons which perhaps motivations which might not have been completely pure, but somebody who takes on the full gamut of Jewish life in every respect and identifies with the Jewish people is called a Gerei Tzedek. So we'll want to take a look at some of these groups and understand them more clearly, and then to try and understand what it is exactly that we're asking for in regard to this sixth group of people, and how did we come to be included with this august company, little old us, amongst the tzaddikim and the chassidim and everybody else who's the giants of the Torah world, and we've somehow jumped onto their coattails, hanging on for the ride, and we've included ourselves slightly cheekily in this blessing as well. So there's some things to be discussed in the next couple. So we have these six groups of people in this blessing, as follows: the righteous, the pious, the elders of your people. While reading in Hebrew, Ala tzadikim, Vala chasidim, Val zigne amacha beit Yisrael, Val pleitat sofrehem, Val ger hatzedek, Va'aleinu, and Dash. 6, just counted it. Different interpretations as to who these 6 are, although there's consensus amongst about some of them. So starting with Al HaTzadikim, who are the righteous. According to some commentaries, they are the righteous ones who conduct themselves uprightly. But according to Eli Munk, these are the people who, consistent with the previous blessings, they're the ones who pursue justice in this world, tzedek. That's their business. They are people whose entire motive is their sense of justice. The second group over here are called Hasidim, and Hasidim, by the way, you might think is a contemporary term. You might think that these are people who are kind of like running around, jumping up and down, at the kotel or whatever. Hasidim appears at a very early stage in the Talmud. And it, in fact, there's a discussion about the Hasidim Rishonim, the early Hasidim, who used to spend 3 hours preparing for each prayer, Shachrit, Mincha, and Mariv, which would take 12 hours, and then an hour praying, etc. And the Talmud asks an obvious question: if you're going to spend so much time of your day davening, how are you ever going to make a living? And the Talmud answers, well, you see, to make a living, you don't have to always spend a lot of time. If you have a bit of success, it can come very quickly. So as a result of their efforts in their davening, they were blessed with the minimum amount of time that was required in order to be able to make their to earn a living. So they were the Hasidim. So here we translate the Hasidim either as those who are pious in the sense that they go beyond the letter of the law. That's what Hasidim historically has meant, people who are more pious than everybody else. Alternatively, the Hasidim are the people who are motivated by love. So you have some people who are motivated by justice in their lives, others for whom love is the primary thing. Each soul has its own special quality, and each soul expresses itself in the world in terms of its unique quality. Each person finds out what it is that they are, what it is that drives them from deep down inside. And for some, it's about the pursuit of justice. For others, it's about kindness to others. And there are different groups of people, and we acknowledge and recognize these differences. We're not all the same. And then you have a third group over here who are called Zakenim, the elders of the people. The elders of the people is always a reference to scholars. It's based upon a verse in the Torah. Darta Panei Zaken, in Leviticus, you shall stand up before the elderly. And the Talmud comments on that. Who is the elderly? Zeh shekana chokhmah. This is the one who has acquired wisdom. So Zaken, old, is synonymous in this instance with wise or learned. By the way, that same verse, which we'll come back to in a moment for other reasons, starts off by saying that mipnei seva takum, you shall stand before an old person. And the next part of the verse is v'hadarta panei zaken, and you shall honor the zaken, the elderly. It sounds like in this verse over here that the two parts of the verse are talking about the same thing, but it's not so. The first part of the verse, which says that you shall livnei seva takum, before an elderly person you shall stand. This isn't any old person, irrespective of whether they are have wisdom or don't have wisdom. There is a Torah injunction that you have to give honor to the elderly. not something which in our young society today is always properly observed. And the next part of it is not just the elderly, but the elderly who are wise. For them, you have to give a special kind of kavod. So those are the zakenim over here. So far we have those who love justice, the tzaddikim. We have those who love acts of kindness and chesed. Those are the chasidim. We have the zakenim, those who have acquired an enormous amount of wisdom. These are the people you go to when you have a question about halacha and you need to have a psak halacha. So you go to one of these sages. The next group over here are referred to as the Pleitat Sofreihem, the remnant of the scribes. And here you have a wide range of different interpretations as who it is in regard to who it is that we're praying for. So according to one opinion, it is literally the scribes. In other words, there are people who's different to the scholars and others. Their entire job is carrying forward the Masorah, carrying forward the traditions. So they're into diktuk, they're into notes in the Torah, they're into writing Sifrei Torah, they are the Sofrim, they are the ones who are kind of the technical guys, technical people who are dealing with all the issues relating to Masorah. That is one opinion as to who they are. A second opinion is the Sofrim refers to the teachers and the instructors. So teachers are very important in our society, so we're making a special prayer for those who are able to teach others. And Jonathan Sachs puts it very nicely over here, because the word pleita means a remnant, the remnants of the Sofrim. Who are we praying for over here? A very, very special group of people. They are survivors. They are the survivors who, a reference to those Jews who endured religious persecution under the Greeks and the Romans, and later in Europe survived the Crusades and the Holocaust. Judaism has lost many of its greatest scholars as martyrs. And of course, in our age, we'll be talking about the survivors of the Holocaust as well. Why are they included in this prayer over here? For two reasons. First of all, because they are people who've been through terrible, terrible agonies and have survived. But more importantly, they have something very special and very unique to teach us. It is true that a Torah scholar can offer us a lot of great wisdom, but you can never compare that wisdom to the wisdom which comes from a person who has acquired their wisdom in the very hard university of life, who has been subjected to persecution and to seen terrible hatred. They have a very special message. It's not just a message of defiance and of courage, and neither is it just a message that helps to remind us of these things which have happened in the past, and to keep those images alive in our minds so that we can ensure that they don't happen again. But because they have a very, very special quality in them, that when they speak, it comes from a different place altogether. It comes from a different part of their souls, of their hearts, and therefore their messages carry a different kind of power. And so we include them over here as the Pleitat Sofreihem, the remnant of the teachers, the ones who are the survivors. And that's very poignant, that we acknowledge in every age that there are these people and that we need to include them in our prayers. So we've got another two to go, the Ger Tzedek and Aleinu, but we'll leave that for tomorrow. So we are looking at the 13th blessing, the 6 people for whom we ask the Almighty to have compassion and to look at them and to support them. And they are the tzaddikim, who we've defined as those who spend their lives seeking justice, tzedek, justice. That's what they're about. The Chasidim, who we've defined as those who spend their lives pursuing acts of kindness and acts of love. Malzigne Amcha, the Zakenim referred to as the clever people, the learned people, the poskim, the people we turn to give us direction in terms of the halacha. I'll play Tat Sofrahim and the remnant of the Sofrahim. Yesterday, we looked at 3 different interpretations of this term, but settled with the one that Jonathan Sachs refers to in his commentary. And these are survivors, the people who have been through terrible times and have survived them. And we pray that because they have so much to offer us, that the Almighty should have compassion upon them and to give them the strength to be able to share their experiences and to teach us from their very special reservoir of wisdom. And then the next 2 categories are Al-Geri HaTzedek, the righteous converts, and Aleinu, and ourselves. And it's these 2 that we want to speak about today. So the first question over here is, how did Gerim, how did converts come into this whole story over here? We're talking about the greatest, the most pious, the highest levels of the Jewish hierarchy in terms of what they have to offer us to us in terms of learning and piety, and life experience. And all of a sudden, the Ger jumps in on the story as well. And the answer is because it is in a pasuk. Actually, it's not directly in the pasuk. It's in the combination of 2 pasukim. If you turn to the Chumash in Kedoshim, in Vayikra, we have in chapter 19, verse number 32, Mipnei Sevatakum, arise, stand up before the hoary head, before an old person, Vadarta Pnei Zaken, and you shall give honor to the Zaken, who's described over here as exactly like the Zaken in our blessing. Zaken is Zeh Shekana Chochma. This is the person who has acquired a great deal of wisdom. V'yaretem alekecha, and you shall fear God, because Ani Hashem, I am God. That is verse number 32. Verse number 33 says, V'chi aguritcha ger be'artzachem, and if there should be a convert who lives in your land, lo tonu oto, don't taunt him or don't make his life miserable. So you see that the Chumash itself places the Zaken and the Ger alongside each other in 2 verses, one following on from the other. And it was based upon that our sages, when they composed this blessing, understood that we should include the Gerim over here as well. There is another reason for it, which I'll come back to in just a moment, but let's talk now about Aleinu. So once again, it's pretty much the same sort of question you can ask that we asked about the Ger. What is he doing in this blessing over here? And you can ask even a stronger question, what are we doing in this blessing? A little old me, how did I come to be associated with all of these pious people, with the Hasidim and with the Zakenim, with the Tzadikim, even those people, those Ger Tzedek, those righteous Gentiles, made such a huge effort to come into Judaism, and me, I just slept along. So what am I doing in this blessing over here? How can I be asking the Almighty to have compassion upon me as well? And the answer is that it is true that in a certain sense, we don't belong in this blessing. Okay, plain and simply, we don't. We're not in this august company over here. But nevertheless, despite all whatever efforts we can make for ourselves, and of course we have to rely upon our own efforts to achieve all these things which are spoken about in this blessing over here, it doesn't come naturally. Nevertheless, we always can ask for a little bit of help from our HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We ask for his compassion. Ribono Shel Olam, please, can you help me a little bit as well? That's says the story of a little old lady her prayer was overheard in the ladies' gallery. She said, Ribono Shel Olam, I know that you will help me eventually. He said, but can you help me a little bit until you help me? that would be good as well. So we ask for just a little bit of help from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Can you help me along, please? I'm trying my hardest, but can I just include me while you're giving a blessing to all of these other great people? Can you think about me as well? I could really do with a little bit of help, please, in my life. And so we are slightly embarrassed, but not ashamed to include ourselves in this blessing. I want to come back to the Ger Tzedek for a moment, because remember that this blessing, this 13th blessing, follows on from the 12th blessing, which was the blessing in which we try to talk about all those people who have departed from Judaism and who have undermined Judaism and have slandered Judaism and have worked to destroy the principles of Judaism. That's the 13th blessing. And the 14th blessing is about the tzaddikim and everyone else, and the Ger Tzedek. Although historically the 14th blessing, this blessing over here, came a lot earlier than the 13th blessing. As you know, the blessing against heretics in the Minim only came, and Christians only came in the time of Rabban Gamliel, which was much later. And these blessings, the rest of the Amidah, was established at the time of the Anshe Knesset HaGadolah, at the beginning of the Second Temple. So historically, there is no connection between these two. But there's a delicious kind of irony over here in placing the one next to the other, because they're almost as if the one blessing balances the other. We start off by for the removal and the punishment of those who withdrawn themselves from God, and in contradistinction, the next blessing is a plea for the welfare of all of those of other nations who've carved their own way to Judaism, the ones who have actually come to join us and have distinguished themselves by their righteous conduct as part of our people, and the remnants, the ones who are hanging over there, the ones who went through terrible, terrible events in their lives and didn't lose their faith, and they still remained faithful to the God of Israel despite what happened to them. So this is an amazingly beautiful contrast to the previous blessing. Some leave and some arrive, and that's the story of Judaism. And we talk about, in this blessing, the ones who have arrived, the Ger Tzedek, and the ones who are pious. And somewhere in that as well, we say, Ribono Shel Olam, can I be counted amongst the ones who hung in? I'm still with you. I haven't left you. At least for that, can I have your compassion for hanging in and not walking away from your Torah and from your life, from your lifestyle, from all the things that Judaism stands for, even though on occasion it's very tempting. And the world around me is one which beckons and calls loudly. And nevertheless, I'm still here. I'm a faithful Jew, and for that reason, I want to be included in this blessing over here of Mish'an, Miftach, Letzadikim, of the one who is supported by and who's continued to believe in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that's this beautiful 13th blessing. Yerushalayim Irecha v'rachamim tashuv, may return to Jerusalem in mercy, v'tishkon b'tocha, may you dwell in it, kasher dibarta, as you said, or as you promised. So this is a prayer not about us returning to Jerusalem, because we've already done that one. We remember that was our pivotal prayer when we said to Kabah Shofar Gadol Lecheretenu, blow the great shofar, and all of us will be gathered together and brought back to Jerusalem, brought back to our land. So this is not a prayer for us to return to Jerusalem. This is a prayer for God to return to Jerusalem. And that therefore raises a question as to whether he actually ever left Jerusalem, so much so that we need to ask him to come back. And the second question for today is the expression, V'rachamecha tashuv, may you return in mercy. Because the reason why that's a question is because anybody who was paying attention to the Haftarah on last Shabbat, Chazon Yeshayahu, the vision of Isaiah, will know that the Haftarah ended with very famous words, that Zion b'mishpat tipadeh, v'shaveha b'tzdaka, that Zion will be redeemed through justice and her captives through acts of kindness and charity. So where does mercy come in? If justice and tzedakah, righteousness, are the ways to bring us back to Jerusalem, that should suffice. And of course, we've already asked for that, because we've had a blessing in which we have asked for as a precursor for the coming back to Jerusalem, Hashiva Shoftenu Kavrishonah, bring back our judges as at first. In other words, reestablish justice. So the answer to the question of how justice arrives over here is once again in the pasuk, but it's a very beautiful pasuk, and it's a verse which occurs in those beautiful chapters in chapter 30 of the book of Deuteronomy, which is brought in Parashat Nitzavim, which speaks about the return of the ultimate return of Israel, the people of Israel from exile. And there we have the following verse in chapter 30, verse number 3. V'shav Hashem Elokecha et shivutcha, the Almighty will return your captives. V'richamecha, and he will have mercy upon you. V'shav, and he will return. V'kibetzcha mikol amim, and you should be gathered from all of the people. Asher hefitzcha Hashem Elokecha shama, where the Almighty has scattered you. In this verse over here, you have the word V'shav v'richamecha, may he have mercy upon you, v'shav, and may you return. So you see that mercy and return are contiguous in the same verse, one word after the other. And that is what gave our sages the idea that in this verse over here, that when we speak about returning to Jerusalem, we should insert the word berachamim, that should be done in mercy. In other words, there's two things going on over here. If it is a question of us preparing to come back to Jerusalem, then Isaiah was quite correct. It needs to be done through mishpat and tzedakah. Those are the things, the precursors that we're speaking about in this Amidah, of the things that we need to do in order to be able to create a state in which the Almighty is ready to come back into Jerusalem. But when the Almighty comes back into Jerusalem, that can only be achieved through an act of mercy on his behalf. Although the Zion's redemption will be brought about by justice, the rebuilding of the temple, the return of the Shekhinah can only come about as an efflux of divine mercy. And that is the two different sides of this equation. But this verse over here that I quoted to you tells us quite a lot more, because looking back at our blessing over here, it's almost as if you shall return to Jerusalem, which implies that God left Jerusalem. And one has to ask the question, did God ever leave Jerusalem? What do you mean leave? What is the concept of God being present or God leaving? Well, we describe that in terms of exile. And I want to take you back to this verse over here that I've just quoted, because Rashi quotes to us the very well-known Gemara in Megillah 29a in the name of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who notes that there's a grammatical incorrection, that this verse of ours could have been phrased more elegantly. Instead of saying V'shav Hashem Elokecha, it should have said V'heishiv Hashem Elokecha et shivutcha. That means that the Almighty will bring you back. That's direct. God will bring you back. And so instead, the implication over here is V'shav Hashem, that God will come back. And it's on this over here that the Gemara says, Haya ya lechtov v'heshiv et shivutcha. The verse should have more elegantly said, God will return you. Rabbeinu lamdu mikana, sages learn from here, kaviachol, that so to speak, shashchina shruya im Yisrael b'tzara galutam, that the Almighty himself goes into exile when together with the Jewish nation during the time of their agonizing time in exile. It's as if the Almighty himself travels with them into exile and is with them in exile. And it is only when they come back to the land that the Almighty himself comes back to the land as well. When they return, it's as if the Almighty ascribes the redemption to himself, that he himself will return with them. So we have over here the concept of God going into exile. The best way to describe exile, actually, is to describe what happens when a person goes to sleep. In other places, we talk about the Almighty neither slumbers nor sleeps. So we have this metaphor of sleeping. What happens when one sleeps is that you're still alive, of course, but you don't have power over your body. There's no control. Things don't work in the right way. Strange dreams happen. Your limbs move around without any control. You flay around in bed, etc. When your neshama comes back into your body, there is control over your life and there's directiveness. So the idea of the Almighty going into exile is that, in a sense, his presence withdraws. He is there, but his influence is not there. It's like a body without that is asleep. And therefore haphazard things happen, things which don't seem to make any sense. Strange dreams, strange activities, strange things happen in the world which have no coherence, because the Almighty's presence is not there. He is not expressing himself. It's not as if a body, it's not as if you have a person who is awake and alive and in control. So what we have over here is a very beautiful prayer, that while Jerusalem might be there as a city, as an entity, with activity and with things happening, but it's not the same as the way it would be if God were revealed in the city, if his presence were felt and expressed and was tangible, like a person who's awake. Then Jerusalem would feel different. And that's what we're praying for over here. It's not the rebuilding of Jerusalem per se in terms of its buildings. It is about the return of the Shekhinah, the divine presence, that it should express itself in Jerusalem. That's what we're praying for. And that can only happen b'rachamim, through the mercy of God. We will do our part in terms of mishpat and tzedakah, but then we turn to the Almighty's mercy for him to say, okay, it's time for me to reveal myself again. I've been hiding all this time in Jerusalem. Now I'm going to wake. This, by the way, just to point out to you, is one of the explanations, the mystical explanations of that moment in the Megillah, when the Chazan actually has to raise his voice and say, B'layla hahu nadada shnat hamelech. On that night, the king awoke. And if you look at the commentaries, they say, which king was it who awoke? Not King Achashverosh, it was the king of the world who awoke. Once again, this metaphor of waking up, of a soul being active in the body. And that was the turning point in the Megillah, of course, when everything changed. God's mercy was aroused. That's what we're asking for here in the blessing. Wake up, Hashem, is what we're saying. Bring your Shekhinah back into Jerusalem, and then the world is going to look different. There's more to talk about in this blessing, but we'll come back to that tomorrow. So let's take a look at some of the wording now in V'Yerushalayim Erecha B'Rachmim Tashuv. To Jerusalem, your city, may you return in mercy. The next phrase says, V'Tishkon B'Tocha, and may you dwell in her, Ka'asher Dibata, just as you said that you would. And Jonathan Sachs in the Green Siddur translates the word Dibata not as says, but as you promised. Well, where did God say that he would dwell in Jerusalem, or promise that he would dwell in Jerusalem? Do we have a source for that in any of our writings? And the answer is yes, it is actually in Zechariah. In Zechariah chapter 2, verse number 14, we have, which by the way happens to come from the Haftarah of Behalotecha and of Shabbat Chanukah, a very well-known opening of a Haftarah. Rani v'simchi bat Zion, sing and rejoice, O daughter of Zion. A daughter of Zion is a reference to Jerusalem. Jerusalem is called the daughter, the child of Zion, which is a very lovely idea. So sing and rejoice, O daughter of Zion, ki hinni va, because behold, I am coming, says God, v'shechanti b'tochech, and I will dwell in her midst, Ne'um Hashem, says the Almighty. So here you have a source in the prophets in which God says, I will quite specifically come and dwell in Jerusalem. And that is the basis of this phrase over here, V'tishkon b'tocha kasher debata. The next phrase reads as follows, Uvenei ota, and build, referring still to God. God will build b'karov b'yamenu, speedily in our days, binyan olam, an everlasting edifice, an everlasting building. So this is the basis upon which we say that the third Beit HaMikdash will not be destroyed. There is once again a Midrash, Yalkut Shimoni, which references to this and says, on Edotecha ne'emnu ma'od, your testimonies are very faithful. On this verse says the Midrash that Moshe Rabbeinu said before HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Ribono Shel Olam, you have muted the sound of Torah and of your house, and you have boosted the noise of the wicked. Boost instead the sounds of Torah in your house, because it is stated, holiness becomes your house, O Lord, forevermore. And therefore, if you do so, then its fate will not be the same as before. Shlomo HaMelech built the temple and was destroyed. Ezra built it and it was destroyed. But you are forevermore. And that once again is based upon the verse, holiness becomes your house, O Lord, forevermore. A reference to the fact that the binyan is going to be eternal. So that's the binyan olam, something which is created by man. It has to have an end. Something which is built by God lasts forever. And then v'chisei David mehera l'tocha tachin, and may you speedily and may you install within it soon the throne of David. And the question over here is, how does David come into Jerusalem? I mean, what's the connection? Why do we mention the throne of David when we're mentioning the rebuilding of Jerusalem? And the answer to that actually lies in a piece of Talmud from the Jerusalem Talmud in Brachot, where we have Kolel Shel David bebonei Yerushalayim. That whenever you talk about the rebuilding of Jerusalem, it has to be combined in one single prayer with the establishment of the Messianic kingdom. The two are considered to be inseparable. So by definition, whenever you talk about Yerushalayim, you have to talk about Kisei David, which is the throne of David, in other words, the messianic throne. Finally, we come to the last part of the blessing. Baruch atah Hashem, bonei Yerushalayim, blessed are you, O Lord, who builds Jerusalem. Well, where do we find this phrase, bonei Yerushalayim? And the answer is in our Shabbat davening. In Psalm 147, one of the Psalms which we recite on Shabbat, in verse number 2, Bonei Yerushalayim Hashem, the Almighty God builds Jerusalem, Nidchei Israel lichanes, the dispersed of Israel he gathers together. So you see that all of the words over here, each part of the phrase is actually rooted in our scripture, in our in Tanakh, in our Tehillim, etc. And altogether, this is the idea of the rebuilding of an eternal building and Mashiach. Having said that, and having referred to Kisei David, the throne of David, which is a messianic throne, one now has to ask the question, which we will come to in due course, as to why we need to have the next blessing, et Tzemach David Avdecha Mehera Tatzmiach, why we speak for the speedy coming of David, having already mentioned him in this blessing. And that in itself is a whole discussion. So that's this blessing, but for the fact that it's in this blessing that we add a special blessing for Tisha B'Av, and we're going to look at that tomorrow in advance of Tisha B'Av and some of the controversy that relates to that blessing. The Yerushalayim Mincha Barachnim Tashuv, the rebuilding of Jerusalem blessing that we recite every day, is recited, of course, in each one of the Amidahs, Ma'ariv the night before, Shachrit, and at Mincha time. On Tisha B'Av, in the afternoon at Mincha, but only at Mincha, we add a special addition and we change the blessing at the end. And the addition is called the Nachem blessing, the comfort, the console blessing. And in English, it reads as follows. Console, O Lord our God, the mourners of Zion and the mourners of Jerusalem, and the city that is in sorrow, laid waste, scorned, and desolate, that grieves for the loss of its children, that is laid waste of its dwellings, robbed of its glory, desolate without inhabitants. She sits with her head covered like a barren, childless woman. Legions have devoured her, idolaters have taken possession of her. They have put your people Israel to the sword and deliberately killed the devoted followers of the Most High. And therefore Zion weeps bitterly and Jerusalem raises a voice. My heart grieves for those they killed. I am in anguish. I'm in anguish for those that they killed. For you, O Lord, consumed it with fire, and with fire you will rebuild it in the future, as it is said, and I myself will be a wall of fire around it, says the Lord, and I will be its glory within. Blessed are you, O Lord. And instead of simply saying Bonei Yerushalayim, we say Menachem Tzion Bonei Yerushalayim. the God who consoles Zion and rebuilds Jerusalem. So the source of this, by the way, source of this blessing is in the Jerusalem Talmud in Brachot, where we have the expression, "Comfort, O Lord our God, the mourners of Jerusalem," and the rest of the prayer. However, in that particular prayer in the Jerusalem Talmud, it doesn't begin with the word comfort, rachem. Nachem and rachem sound very similar, but they have completely different meanings. Nachem means to console. So rachem means to have mercy. Nachem means to console. And originally, apparently, this blessing was about rachem. So why did it change to nachem? The answer is given by the Ritva, one of the Rishonim, and it also explains why we only recite this blessing in the afternoon and not at Mariv at night and at Shachrit. And the Ritva says as follows: Nachem is recited at the Mincha service, the practice being very similar to the case where one has already buried his dead and now seeks to be comforted. But in the evening and the morning services, the worshipper commences the passage with Rachem, have mercy, like one who's dead is still unburied before him. So it seems that apparently in previous times, this prayer would be said at Mariv, Shachrit, and Mincha, and at Mariv and Shachrit, they would say Rachem, and at Mincha it would change to Nachem, for the reason that the Ritva gives. We somewhere along the line dropped the Mariv and the Shachrit, and we're left only with the Mincha, and therefore we're left with Nachem. So that explains why we have the blessing at Mincha time and its source. So looking at the structure of this blessing, it goes as follows. It begins with a plea that the mourners of Zion should be comforted, and then there are four adjectives to describe the destroyed city. Is described as desolate, laid waste of her dwellings, despised because of the downfall of her glory, and desolate through the loss of her inhabitants. After that, we have a description of the city as a barren woman and her fate. And as a consequence, Jerusalem weeps bitterly, and Jerusalem gives forth her voice. And then her pain is described in terms which are very similar to that of Jeremiah, when it says, "Oh, my heart, heart grieves for their slain." This is Jerusalem speaking, as if Jerusalem was alive and had a heart and could mourn for those who were her inhabitants. Oh, how it grieves for the slain, my innards, my innards. And then you have after that a transition sentence that leads to a note of comfort. For you, O Lord, consume her with fire, and with fire you will in the future restore her. And this, of course, is based upon a passage in the Talmud in Bava Kama, where we have the laws relating to somebody who starts a fire. If somebody starts a fire, they have the responsibility of paying for the damages of the fire, because it was they who started it, even though the fire goes beyond their property and goes into other people's property. But you're responsible for having started it, therefore you have to pay for it. And the Gemara says something similar happened in relation to Jerusalem. Says the Gemara as follows: the Holy One, blessed be he, says, I am obliged to make restitution for the fire that I kindled, because it was I who kindled a fire in Zion. And we see this in the book of Eicha that we're going to read tonight. And he has kindled a fire in Zion, which has devoured its foundations. And therefore, says God, I'm going to have to pay for it and make good. And therefore it is I who will one day build it anew with fire, because it says in Zechariah, and this is what's quoted in our blessing over here, for I, says the Lord, will be unto her a wall of fire round about, and I will be the glory in the midst of her. And that is the content of the blessing. So the big question which arises in regard to this blessing is why we still recite it. Because when you look at it at face value, many of the terms which we use when we recite this blessing are no longer truthful. They don't actually describe the situation as it pertains in Jerusalem today. For example, are we going to say today that a city that is in sorrow, laid waste, scorned and desolate, that grieves for the loss of its children, robbed of its glory, desolate without inhabitants, like a barren, childless woman? None of that seems to make sense, because you go to Jerusalem today, you see a thriving, active city, and you see the fulfillment of the some of the prophecies of young people together with old people, etc., thronging the streets. The city has been rebuilt. They're beautiful buildings. You could hardly call it a desolate city. And that is the fundamental problem that confronted us in 1967 when we recaptured the and a bit of head scratching, amongst the sages of the time, the leaders of the time. What is the position about changing the text of an ancient prayer? Is it something which is permitted if the prayer no longer makes sense? So this led to a furious debate in Israel, and it led eventually to, I suppose, 3 possible resolutions to this. The first was the most daring, and the daring was Rav Goren. Rav Goren was an extraordinarily brilliant man. Anybody who's read his biography or his autobiography, it is really something quite amazing. He was an Ilui, a young genius, and he was hugely learned, but he was very, very daring in the halacha. And many of the laws which had to be dealt with in the new situation of Israel, in terms of burying the dead, soldiers, etc., all of those laws he promulgated, sometimes with very, very daring halachic decisions. And here too, he was very daring, and he said, this prayer is no longer relevant. I'm going to go back to rabbinic sources. I'm going to find some authentic rabbinic sources that will allow us to reframe this, to continue to say a prayer, but to concentrate mainly on the spiritual elements of Jerusalem that are still lacking, as opposed to the physical elements, which are abundant, etc. And therefore, he wrote a new prayer, praying for the temple, spiritual revival, and those aspects of redemption that we have still to merit. And that was followed by many people, and continues to be followed by many people in Israel, particularly the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And we'll come back to that in a moment. The second major view came from Ovadia Yosef, the previous chief rabbi, but of course was chief rabbi at the time. And his opinion was not to make any changes in the wording, but instead, when reciting this prayer, to concentrate on this spiritual situation in Jerusalem, which is still very, very much lacking. Even though you might have had more yeshivot than any time in history, the spiritual state of Jerusalem is still far from ideal. And Rav Soloveitchik apparently agreed with this and said that so long as the Beit HaMikdash has not been built, we should continue saying the original wording, because one can still say most of the wording, destroyed, deserted without her sons, because it pertains to the Temple Mount itself, not to the environs of Jerusalem, but the Temple Mount is exactly appropriate to the words that we recite. There was a third approach, which was a compromise approach, which was put forward by a previous chief rabbi of Tel Aviv, Rabbi Chaim David Halevi. He said, look, it's really easy. All we need to do is change one verb. Instead of talking about Jerusalem in the past, we should, in the present, we should talk about it in the past. Shahayata, that was destroyed, not that is destroyed, not in a state of continuous state of being destroyed as it is at the moment. Let's talk about how it was. Shahayata, destroyed. It was destroyed. But this was a very nice solution, but for the fact that it completely reframed the entire prayer by putting it into a prayer of thanksgiving as opposed to a prayer of hope for the future. And that's essentially what this prayer is. And the entire context of may you return to Jerusalem is a prayer of hope for the future. So that was the problem. We had an episode in our shul a number of years ago, the old shul. We had an extraordinary scholar who was with us for over a year, Rabbi Moshe Hare. Moshe Hare was one of the most brilliant men I've ever encountered in my life. He was an academic. He had been the professor of Talmud and history at Jerusalem University. He was now emeritus, and he was doing some research here in London. But he was a man who was completely fluent in the entire Torah, and an incredible memory, could quote you anything from anywhere, broadly knowledgeable across secular and religious, a real most unusual man. And we had a wonderful time with him in our community. He taught us a huge amount. Some of you might remember him, a real yakkeh in many respects, but a very, very unusual man who had grown up not in the yeshiva tradition, but in the academic tradition, but as a very, very dati man. And on Tisha B'Av, we felt it was appropriate to ask him to lead the davening. So he got up on the bimah, and shortly before he was about to start, he said to us, from already up on the bimah, he said, by the way, you do know that I do not recite the traditional prayer of Nachem, I recite the prayer which has been formulated by Rav Goren, the prayer which people of Jerusalem, and I'm a Yelid Yerushalayim, I live in Jerusalem, I was born over there, I cannot bring myself to say the old prayer. Now we had a terrible quandary because there is a halacha that if a person has gone up onto the bimah or gone to take the position at the lectern to lead the davening, it would be considered completely impolite, an affront, an insult to pull the person down. It would be an insult to the person's kavod to ask them to leave and to replace them with someone else. And so we're faced now with a dilemma. A shul has a minhag, and the minhag in England and the United Synagogue is to recite this prayer exactly as it was historically constituted. We do not make the changes. On the other hand, there was somebody who was going to publicly recite this prayer as the shaliach tzibur for the whole community, who was not prepared to recite this prayer, and we had to ask whether this distinguished scholar could be asked to leave his position and make way for someone else. What do you think we should have done? I've got no idea whether halachically I was correct or not, but I felt that kavod habriyut, that the honor and the dignity of people takes precedence over the prayer.
Absolutely.
So we allowed him to continue, and as Laurie said, that in our own prayers, of course, we said the appropriate nachem. But the shliach tzibur is, of course, representing the entire community and carrying our prayers up to Shemayim on our behalf. And he was carrying a prayer which was the wrong prayer, which has its own serious halachic ramifications. Nevertheless, that's a decision we made because that's a kind of a South Hampstead decision that would be in the ethos of our community. But whether it's halachically correct or not, I've never bothered to find out. I suppose I should, but I never went and pursued it to find out whether I'd done the right thing or not. Anyway, that's of your servant David, soon flower. The word samach is translated over here as offshoot by Jonathan Sachs. In other places, it's always just translated as offspring. In other words, the descendants of King David. An offshoot, may the offshoot of your servant David soon flower. And the karno tarum b'shuatecha, the word karno is normally translated as the horn of his salvation, but Jonathan Sachs says, and may his pride be raised high by your salvation. Ki lishuatcha kivina kol yom, for we wait for your salvation all day. Baruch atah Hashem atzmiach ken yeshua. Blessed are your Lord, who makes glory of salvation to flourish. The origins of this blessing, like the origins of the blessing against the slanderers, etc., is a matter of controversy. And the controversy is actually one which we see between the Babylonian and the Jerusalem Talmuds. Jerusalem Talmud, of course, was developed in Jerusalem, self-explanatory, but there are two different versions, and on occasion you find that while 90% or 95% is an agreement, you do find some disagreements between them. And the disagreement in this instance over here relates to a controversy as to when this blessing was actually introduced. According to the Jerusalem Talmud, the prayer for the restoration of the Davidic line, in other words, for the Mashiach, should be included in the blessing for Jerusalem. And that's exactly the way we have it, because the 14th blessing, may you return to Jerusalem in mercy, contains the line, as we've discussed, and may you speedily reestablish the throne of David in it. That, of course, is a prayer for the Messianic age, for the reestablishment of the kingdom of David. So the Jerusalem Talmud says that's the proper place to pray for it. And as a consequence, we don't have another blessing. So according to the Jerusalem Talmud, even after the blessing of Lamal Shinim, the blessing against the slanderers, was introduced, there's still only 18 blessings, the Shmona Esra. According to the Babylonian Talmud, no, this needs its own special blessing, in which case there are 19 blessings. What could be the difference, the reason for the difference between them? And fascinatingly, there's a medrash which suggests that the reason for the introduction of this blessing was exactly the same as the reason for the introduction of the blessing, V'lamalshinem, the one against heretics and slanderers, which, as you recall, was introduced at a later stage because of the growth of Christianity and the influence it was having on Jews who were now defecting to the new religion. And we had that whole big debate as to whether how they would deal with the Christians, etc. And eventually, the Malshinim was introduced as reluctantly introduced as an additional blessing in the Amidah. And the Medrash seems to point to the fact that the same reasoning would have applied to the introduction of this blessing as well, because we have a very fundamental problem with Christianity. Christianity's problem is, our problem with Christianity is that according to them, Mashiach has already arrived, and in the person of their leader, Jesus. And if that's the case, we have a fundamental threat to the whole foundations of Jewish belief. We are waiting for Mashiach. Mashiach hasn't arrived yet. If you say the Mashiach has arrived, what is going to be left of Judaism to pray for? The whole underpinning of our religion is knocked away. So this is an enormous, enormous threat. And as Eli Munk puts it, for by teaching the belief that the Messiah in the person of its founder had already arrived, Christianity immediately set itself in direct opposition to a fundamental teaching of Judaism. The entire question of the right of Judaism to exist was dependent upon the recognition of the founder of Jerusalem, King David, as Mashiach. So therefore, they decided, according to the Jerusalem Talmud, to add this additional blessing. And significantly in this blessing, we have the phrase, Ki lishuatcha kivinu kol hayom. For your salvation, we wait all day long. In other words, this is the direct attack on Christianity. You say Messiah has arrived. We are still waiting for Messiah, and we're waiting all day long. So that is a very fascinating background, I find to this blessing. But there's some wording in this blessing that is very, very significant. One in particular is the word tzemach David. And we'll come to that because not only is it an interesting word in itself, but it is one which has caused great controversy in Anglo Jewry, in particular in relation to the prayer for the state of Israel. But we'll come to that on the next occasion. Just been talking about Tzemach David Avdacham, Tzemach David Avdacham Ahera Tatzmiach, speedily caused the offshoot of your servant David to soon flower. And that led us to a slight detour in terms of talking about the inclusion of this phrase, Reshit Tzmichat Geulatein, the beginning of the flowering of your redemption, in the prayer for Israel. And I wanted to stick with this for a little while because Neil did some interesting research yesterday and came up with some really fascinating pieces of information that I thought I'd just share with you because of its interest. So the first is an article that was written by Rav Amital. He was, of course, the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivat Har Etzion in the Gush, and he was nifty, he passed away in 2010. And this was at a time when there was great doubt amongst some of the religious Zionists about whether Israel was in fact Reshit Tzmichat Gulatenu, the beginning of the flower of redemption. And the crisis in this regard was provoked by the withdrawal from Gush Etzion, from Gaza, with the dismantling of the kibbutz of the settlement, which caused tremendous upset in the religious community, both in the very principle of it, and also in the execution of it. So what he says in this article over here it goes back to Rav Kook's son, Rav Tzvi Yehuda, and he said, what was the basis of their belief that the Messianic era had begun with the establishment of the State of Israel? And very interestingly, they related to the fact that for the first time we had sovereignty over the land. They actually saw sovereignty as being the significant component that made all the difference in the world. And this is partially based upon Maimonides, who says that the first stage of the Messianic redemption is the only thing that will change in that early stage is that we will actually not be any longer under foreign dominion. In other words, that we will actually have sovereign control for the first time over our land. And since that happened in 1948, since sovereignty was established over the land, this for them was in itself the sign, the indication that this was the beginning of the Messianic age. Then, of course, the crisis arose because giving away sovereignty, in other words, ceding your sovereignty, either in Gaza or in later in regard to the peace process in Oslo, etc. This then shattered the idea that we actually are a sovereign state, because if you're forced to give away parts of your state, even though you might retain control over other parts of it, but it indicates you no longer have absolute sovereignty, and therefore that undermines the whole principle of Reshit Tzmichat Geulatenu, Itchalta the Geula, the beginning of the Geula. So that was the problem. Nevertheless, he wants to answer this and to say that when the state was established, some of the greatest Torah sages in the world, and he says some of whom he knew because he had come from Eastern Europe, declared that although we are not living in the time of the revealed end of the footsteps of the Mashiach, there's still great importance to the political freedom of establishing a state. In other words, the fact that we could simply establish a state, even though it was imperfect in many respects, both in terms of external enemies and in terms of the governance of it by people who are not Torah-minded, the fact that we could actually have this political control for the first time over our own lives for 2,000 years, this in the beginning was the very, very beginning of an entirely new era. And he notes over there that Maimonides says that the festival of Hanukkah, what's important about the festival of Hanukkah was that Jewish sovereignty was restored for more than 200 years, even though we know that there was a very low moral standing of many members of the Hasmonean dynasty. So the fact that things are not perfect in itself doesn't detract from the importance of having political control over your own destiny. And that was the thing which changed in 1948 for all of its imperfections. And that's the argument of Rav Amidah. Now the question is, who actually composed the prayer for the State of Israel? And how did it come about that this phrase, Reshit Tzmichat Geulatenu, was inserted in it? And how did it come about that it was not inserted in the English version, the one that we recite? So very interestingly, there was a suggestion that S.Y. Agnon was the composer of the prayer, but actually another view was that it was Rav Herzog, who was the chief rabbi at the time, Rav Yitzhak Isaac Halevi Herzog, who had previously been the chief rabbi in Ireland, was now the chief rabbi of Israel, together with the Sephardi chief rabbi, Rabbi Ben Zion Uziel. And there was this whole question about who was it? Was it them or was it Agnon? At any rate, in 1999, this mystery was finally cleared up by a researcher called Yoel Rappel, who was working for the Schechter Institute, and he tells the following story. This is how it came about. In 1975, Yaakov Goldman, who was Rabbi Herzog's former secretary, wrote to Agnon's daughter, and he told the following story. He said that Herzog was very upset one day because they had asked him to very quickly compose a prayer for the state for an important ceremony. So they were going to now, 1948, suddenly they're going to declare the state of Israel. Oops, we need to have a prayer for the state of Israel. So of course they go to the chief rabbi, and they kind of come on him really quickly. So Goldman, his secretary, says to the chief rabbi, "Don't worry, you write a version and I'll bring it to Mr. Agnon and he'll look at it and make his comments." So Goldman took it to Agnon, showed it to him, and Agnon said to him, "Come back the next day." He comes back the next day, and Agnon had not made many changes. He had simply improved the style here and there because he was, of course, the expert stylistically in writing of Hebrew. And it was Agnon who added the phrase, Reshit Tzmichat Geulatenu. And a little bit later on, he says that we find out that one of the secretaries of Rabbi Shmuel Avidor HaKohen, who was serving as Rav Herzog's secretary for a number of years, was able to bring to Yoel Rappel and give him a photocopy of an official envelope, and on that envelope was printed the office of the Chief Rabbi of Israel, and under that heading somebody wrote the prayer for the state of Israel as it was copied and corrected by Mr. Agnon in his handwriting. So the final conclusion is that it was Rav Herzog and the two chief rabbis, Rav Herzog and Rav Uziel, who composed it, and S.Y. Agnon simply made it look more pretty and significantly added the phrase Reshit Tzmichat Geulatenu. That's the history of that. So we know now who the author was of the prayer for the state of Israel, and how the phrase Reshit Tzmichat Geulatenu came to be included. And now we turn to the English version. And there was an article written by a chief rabbi at the time, Lord Rav Jacobowitz, in the journal called Tradition, which is a journal that was published in America, comes out on a quarterly basis, used to be on a quarterly basis. It's a mouthpiece of orthodoxy. And in 1982, he wrote an article called Religious Responses to Jewish Statehood for Tradition. And in it, he says that he explains the Israeli version. And then he goes on to say that the phrase Reshit Tzmichat Geulatenu was omitted from the text which was authorized by Chief Rabbi Brody at the time. Chief Rabbi Brody did not include, he is the reason why this phrase is not included in the English version. And in typical sort of English way, it looks like we are sitting on the fence. Says Rav Jacobowitz, this version passes no authentic opinion or reserves final judgment on whether or not the present state of Israel is in fact the embryonic nucleus out of which the ultimate redemption is bound to develop. So there we are. The English are sitting on the fence. We're waiting to see. But he goes on to make two other points. The first is that this is not just of theoretical or philosophical significance. It is a fundamental divergence of religious views on the religious interpretation of present-day events, as well as the place of the state of Israel in the perspective of biblical visions. So we're not just talking here about maybe yes and maybe not. It's an entirely different view of Israel. And then he goes on to make one further point, which is very interesting. And he says, actually, this has some practical implications as well. He said, if you believe that the foundation of the state of Israel is Itchalt the Geula, the beginning of the redemption, beginning of the redemptive process, then obviously he says conscious and deliberate efforts must be made to ensure that all the related biblical prophecies fall into place. And that our national strategy must be based upon that assumption. In other words, once you've accepted that this is the Geula, you have to do something about it. The rest, all the rest of the pieces of the jigsaw have to fall into place as well. And he gives some examples. So, for example, he said this might include the planned liquidation of the diaspora, because Itchalt Geula means the beginning of Kibbutz Galut, the end of Galut, bringing in the end of exile. There might be another, he said, maybe there would be maybe you would take a view of an unconcerned resistance to the pressures of world opinion, safe in the knowledge that their advance towards full redemption is irreversible. So who cares what the world thinks? Who cares what kind of pressure America puts on us? It's irrelevant. We're beginning a redemptive process. It's going to happen. We're in the first stages, and the outcome is going to be good. So in other words, the way in which you run the state, the whole approach to Jewish nationhood is defined by this belief in practical terms. On the other hand, he said, if the pre-messianic stage of our current experience lies only in the realm of hope rather than of certainty, then such conclusions may not be warranted, and you have to take a more realistic approach. So the more cautious attitude, which he says in no way would affect the intensity of the commitment to Israel, of course, would cushion our people against the impact of reverses, such as we suffered in the Yom Kippur War. In other words, you have to explain, if this is Itchalt Geula, the beginning of redemption, you have to be able to explain some of the reverses, some of the things which go pear-shaped, things which are not working out. You have a problem with that. So if you take a more cautious approach and say, okay, it's only a hope, it's only an aspiration, it's not for real yet, he said you have an easier way to be able to deal with to understand the things which are happening in modern day Israel. So in other words, this question is not a theoretical question. It has practical implications. And I suppose my conclusion would be to come back to our prayer over here. Et Tzemach David Avdecha Mehera Tatzmiach. When we daven the Amidah and we say these words, what is happening in our head? What's our belief? Do we say these words believing that we are actually in the beginning of the process of redemption because of the establishment of the state of Israel, like the religious Zionists? Or do we simply look at this prayer as a hope and an aspiration? So the whole kavanah that we would have when we recite this prayer is going to be different depending on which camp you align yourself to. And that's very fascinating. It never occurred to me before that you can't just say these words when you daven. You have to nail your beliefs to the mast in order for the prayer to be a genuine prayer for you. What is it that you actually believe? And in a sense, therefore, the question of whether Reshit Tzmichat Geulatenu appears in the prayer for Israel or not actually has a direct impact upon this prayer that we daven every day in the Amidah. The question of whether we believe that the state of Israel is now the beginning of the redemptive process. And therefore, when we're praying this, saying these words over here, we're saying, yes, we're on the road, we're on the way, and I'm only praying now for the completion of it, as opposed to saying these words simply as an aspirational prayer of hope for the future, but not for something which has actually begun. And there's a world of difference between those two approaches. And I'll leave you with that conundrum. In other words, none of us can actually escape the question over here. This is no longer just a question of debate between the chief rabbis of Israel, Herzog, and Rabbi Brody in England, as to whether we include it or omit it. It actually boomerangs and comes back to a decision that we all have to make before we can genuinely approach this prayer. We've spoken very extensively about the first phrase in the 16th blessing, the kingdom of David. Today we'll look at the next phrase very briefly, V'karno tarum b'shuatecha, which Jonathan Sacks translates as, and may his pride be raised high by your salvation. This, of course, he's translated the word keren as pride. Of course, keren means a horn. And the question is, what is the source of this phrase? Where did the sages draw it from? And why is it particularly applied to King David? And the answer to that is because King David applied it to himself in two places. Once in the second book of Shmuel in chapter 22, where we have a song of David, a song that he sang at the end of his life, according to most commentaries towards the end of his life. And in verse number 3 of that song, he writes as follows: Magini, my shield, the keren yishi, and the horn of my salvation, Misgabi Munusi, my stronghold and my refuge. So here you have a keren yishi, the horn of my salvation. And then once again in Psalms, in the book of Psalms, in chapter 18, virtually exactly the same sentence, the same verse and the same phraseology. Once again in verse 3, Adonai Sali Umutsudati, the Lord is my rock and my refuge, Umafalti, and my fortress, my rescuer. And then it goes on, Magini v'keren yishi, he is my shield, and the keren, the horn of my salvation, Mizgabi, and my tower. So it is David who applies to himself the phrase about the Almighty, that the Almighty is his keren yishi, the horn of my salvation. And that's exactly the way it is described over here in our the karna tarum b'shuatecha, once again, the horn of salvation. So there are various interpretations of the word keren. Jonathan Sachs has unusually described it as, translated as pride, but keren, as you know, means a horn. And therefore the Radak, David Kimchi, wants to suggest that the word keren, when we talk about the horn of my salvation, the horn means something which is very strong. It's a concept of strength, because the horn of an animal is there for strength. That's one idea. The second is the idea that of splendor, that the horn of the animal can be part of its splendor. I just wonder whether there is something over here that takes us back to the description of Moses when he comes down very famously from the mountain, and he has karne or, he has rays of light, which Michelangelo, as you probably know, misinterpreted, and he saw translation of the word keren not as the same word, not as a ray, but as a horn. And that is why Michelangelo's statue of David has horns. And that is the origin as to why Jews are sometimes depicted as having horns, all on a mistranslation of the word keren in relation to Moses coming down from the mountain. But nevertheless, there's a double entendre. There's this double sense that a keren can on the one hand be a horn, it can also be a ray of light. So King David over here, when he's talking about God being the keren yishi, the horn of my salvation, there's a sense of upliftness. I also have an image in my mind of a horn being blown, something which is triumphant, something which is very uplifting. So all of these ideas are contained in this single short phrase, keren yishi, the horn of my salvation. Finally, just to mention one other thing today, and which I'll expand on tomorrow, that we continue to say, Ki lishuatcha kevinu kol hayom, for your salvation I await all day. And Rabbi David Emden said that the reason why we have to have this phrase in our Amidah is in order that we should be able to tick the right box after 120 years when we come before the Almighty. It seems that one of the first things that's going to happen when a person passes away is that we're going to have an interview with the boss to try and decide to the extent how well we've managed in the course of our lives, whether we'd actually fulfilled our purpose. And we're going to be asked a number of very pointed questions. It's important, therefore, we should know what questions we're going to be asked, because just like any good exam, you want to be well prepared. And they say a little kid comes home and says to his mother, "Mummy, why is Granny why is Granny all of a sudden reading the Bible so often? His mother says to him, don't worry, darling. She says she's just cramming for her finals. But there are these questions which we have to going to be asked. And they're very fascinatingly, they are as follows. Rabbi said that after departing from the world, when a person is brought to judgment for his life that he lived in this world, they say to him, very first question, fascinating, did you conduct business honestly? Isn't that amazing? That's the first question. Were you honest in business? Did you designate times for Torah study? Did you have children? In other words, did you help to populate the world? And did you ensure that there was continuity in our faith? And the next question they ask is, Tzipita lishua, did you await salvation? During the course of your life, were you always looking out for salvation? Was it something which was in your heart? Was it something which you were aware of? Or did you simply forget about the fact that there's a Jewish future, that we are not yet complete as a nation, that we're still waiting for ultimate fulfillment? And that's a question that's going to be asked. Therefore, says Rav Emden, that we put this into our Amidah, so that, just to remind us that when after 120 years, when we stand before the Almighty, we can give an honest answer and say, yes, boss, I did await for the salvation. Otherwise, we could get caught out. More about this tomorrow, because this concept of waiting for salvation is a very, very interesting one, and it can be explained. Okay, so Ki lishuatcha kivinu kol hayom, for your salvation I await the entire day. Remember what we mentioned yesterday. By the way, my apologies when I spoke about horns in Michelangelo's horns. It's, of course, stupidly, it's not on the statue of David, it's on the statue of Moses. I was just having a senior moment. At any rate, coming back to Rabbi Yaakov Emden, said that the reason why we have to remember wait for the Mashiach each day is because we're going to be asked that question, Tzipita lishua. Did you look forward? Did you wait for? Did you have expectation for salvation? And Rashi, by the way, on that phrase over there says that, Rashi says, for the words of the prophets to come true. In other words, we are waiting for salvation. We are waiting for the words of the prophets to come true, which is an interesting take on that. Rav Kook had a beautiful idea, which I'm going to read to you, in relation to waiting for redemption. And he says that waiting implies keeping a constant vigilance, even when the redemption cannot consciously be sensed. Of course, what he's touching on over here is the fact that for most of us, and possibly at the time that he was saying these words in the very early stages before the formation of the State of Israel, the whole idea of a redemption seems completely and totally improbable. One simply cannot see how it might come about. It is a very distant concept, and therefore it's one which is very difficult in genuine terms to be able to feel any kind of emotion towards, or any kind of genuine feeling. Yes, I am waiting for the redemption, when in your heart of hearts, you've more or less given up hope and said, well, actually nothing very much is going to change. So he was sensitive to this, and therefore he said that the idea over here is of constant vigilance, even when the redemption cannot consciously be sensed, is in the same way that a sentry stands guard duty day after day, year after year, even though he doesn't leave his post, despite the fact that there's absolutely nothing to note. In other words, in benign situations where you're not at war with anybody, you still have sentries, guards standing over there, and they know that nothing's going to happen, but you don't leave your post, you're still standing there. And that's a very nice idea over here. So he says, in addition to that, at every opportunity, whenever there is any kind of awakening, whenever it seems appropriate to perform some deed to hasten the redemption, the person will hasten to act. And he won't give up. In the same way that this watchman, coming back to the analogy again, when he espies from his lookout point that the time has arrived to act, either to retreat or to stand ground, to resist the enemy or the like, It's his obligation to undertake whatever may be necessary in a particular situation. He'll rouse himself without an instant's delay. So he says, Rav Kook in conclusion, for these two occupations, intellectual watchfulness and action at the opportune instant, one is to prepare oneself by reflecting intensively upon the expectancy of redemption. So here you have an idea of how to fulfill this requirement. One is simply to have intellectual awareness all the time, and the second is to be active in every way that one can. So the hoping and waiting means that this is not necessarily a passive process. And that, of course, is the great dividing line in the Jewish world today, in which those who were critical of the Lubavitcher Rebbe of blessed memory's campaigns, to actively try and bring the Mashiach, and said, no, we've just got to wait for it to happen. There's this great big dividing line as to whether one should simply be passive and, say, okay, I wait for it, but there's nothing which I need to do. Or you take the more active view that says that actually I am responsible for bringing Mashiach, the things which I can do to help to bring Mashiach, and those things are not about jumping up and down and shouting Mashiach, 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 or necessarily pointing to a particular person and declaring that they are the Mashiach, but rather to do the kinds of actions that prepares the world, that makes the world more receptive to Mashiach, creates an environment in which it is more possible for the Mashiach to come. And that is the part and parcel of this concept over here of Lishuatcha kivinu kol hayom. I long for your salvation, I mean to say, not just intellectually or somewhere deep inside of me, I accept the words of the prophets that it might happen, but I'm actually going to try and do something about it.